Hello and welcome to the i3 podcast, Conversations with Institutional Investors. My name is Wouter Klein and I'm the editorial director for the Investment Innovation Institute. For more information about our educational forums for institutional investors, please visit our website at www.i3-invest.com. That's the letter I and the number 3-invest.com. There, you can also subscribe to our complimentary newsletter i3 Insights, in which we discuss investment strategy and asset allocation questions with asset owners from around the world. Now, as you all know, we love our disclaimers in this industry, so here's ours. This recording is for educational purposes only. It does not constitute financial advice and is intended for institutional and wholesale investors only. Please enjoy the show. Welcome to the i3 podcast. In this special episode, we're partnering with the University of Technology, Sydney, for the Circle the Square roundtable discussion. And today's topic focuses on environmental risk and repricing of stability. So for most of financial history, the environment was treated pretty much as a given. Stable enough to model around, reliable enough to insure against, and predictable enough to build on. But that assumption is now under pressure. So environmental risk is moving through the financial system in a way that is becoming harder to ignore. Insurance premiums are rising and cover is narrowing. Infrastructure built to last decades is now decommissioned ahead of time, and capital is being asked to fund a transition whose policy settings keep on changing. So this is not an ESG conversation. It's a question about the structural foundations that finance has always taken for granted, and what happens when those foundations start to reprice. So today we have three speakers who are well placed to assess where the pressure lands in this discussion, who absorbs it, and what response we could look at. So we have Martina Lienenlucken, who leads the Center for Climate Risk and Resilience at UTS, and has spent her career examining how environmental change reshapes companies, industries, and financial markets. She was also a key contributor to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 6th Assessment Report. We also have Christy Graham, who is the inaugural CEO of the Australian Sustainable Finance Institute, an independent body that works with Australia's largest financial institutions to realign the finance sector and ensure capital flows to activities that will create a sustainable, resilient and inclusive economy. And Christy, I think you were also involved in the establishment of the first Australian Government Impact Investment Fund. And of course, we also welcome back Rob Brugge, who is Honorary Industry Lecturer at UTS and one of the driving forces behind the UTS Anchor Fund, an educational investment fund managing real money managed by students. The question we are here to explore today is, what does finance do when the assumption it was built on is no longer holding? Rob, maybe I can ask you to sort of set the scene. Has environmental risk moved into the externality or from externality into something that investors now have to price, underwrite, and perhaps insure? What do you think?
Thanks, Walter, and thank you for this opportunity. I guess like the rest of us, I too have been wondering for quite some time now the impact on the environment, not just around my everyday life, but as an investor around the capital markets and around pension funds and superannuations, and how can they maneuver around this highly heated discussions around environmental science. And I guess what triggered it for me was some years back when I did the Camino de Santiago. And I had the good fortune of meeting many people, one of whom was a professor at Oxford, who was a paleontologist, climatologist, which is an interesting mix. Yeah. Naturally, it raised a few eyebrows, and I says, please explain. And he says, well, we study the environment through studying the Earth's history. And he reminded me that of the 4.5 billion year history of the Earth, the last 12,000, roughly, have been the most environmentally stable. And humanity, as we know it, thrived and flourished under that stability. Of course, we had storms. Of course, we had eruptions. Of course, we had floods. But for the most part, the environment the seasons were predictable, and that allowed farming, that allowed agricultural growth, that allowed town growth, and a level of prosperity that humanity has not necessarily seen. So that got me thinking, if that's true, then what happens if we start moving into a new regime, and how will we adapt? We're so accustomed to such stability, such predictability, that it flows through everything from actuarial science in the pricing of insurance products through to assumptions on long duration real assets, that the generator is going to be there and the airports are going to be there and not necessarily damaged. Portfolios assume some level of stability without necessarily pricing it. And for many decades, if not centuries, we've assumed that environmental stability was a freebie, a free get out of jail card. But the last 20 years or 15 years has shown that's not necessarily the case. So while politicians and others debate the science behind the environmental science, there are movements afoot. The markets are beginning to take notice.
Yes. Martina, if I can move to you, do you already see sort of a realization of this enter strategy and potentially more the operational side of businesses?
Yes, I think we are definitely seeing that climate risks are increasingly factored into decision making, and the science is clear, right? We are going to see very fundamental changes in the environmental conditions. We are going to see massive shifts in temperature. We are going to see changes in extreme events, which are going to be very impactful. And in the conversations that we have with leaders in industry, we can definitely see that these risks are already felt. Certainly not across every sector to the same degree or extent, but we do see that some sectors are starting to be very concerned, especially when we look into changes in extreme events and how that affects everything from supply chain, cash flows, asset values, insurability, financing costs, operations, but also strategic viability. So there's now a real question around where should we invest and how are we investing and what can we do to protect these investments in the long run. In many sectors, especially those with long-lived assets, these are certainly very difficult considerations because, some sectors where assets have lifespans of 30, 40, 50 years, we can't just go in and just essentially replace all that infrastructure all at once, which also means that it's very important, obviously, at this present point in time to really see how we can make those decisions going forward so that they last us for the next 20, 30, 40 years in a way also that, this is obviously climate adapted. So from my point, climate and environmental risks are certainly no longer abstract externalities. They are felt increasingly across sectors. They are already impacting strategic decisions or have at least started to in many sectors. And we also see that these risks are becoming more visible generally across our communities as well, right? So examples include flooding, bushfires, right? Heat stress in particular. We're getting more and more days with extreme heat. We see supply chain disruptions as a result. We see water insecurity concerns also around food supply and food supply chains. But that's only the impact side, right? But then we also have the transition risk on the other side, what's happening in terms of changes in regulation, in technology, and that's certainly very impactful in some sectors as well. Australia now, we've got the mandatory climate risk reporting, which to some extent is more of a reporting than an adaptation exercise, right? But I think it is definitely raising awareness that there are physical risk and transition risks coming in. In other markets, we already see that carbon is being priced in, but also investor expectations, I think, are also very much changing. So, we see that, these environmental risks are starting to become more visible and they're starting to be integrated. And, environmental change is definitely starting to matter from an economic perspective. But, I think in particular at this point in time, the question is also, how can we actually adapt to these changes and adapt to them in a way that this makes, sense, but that this is actually also factoring in the very significant environmental changes that we are seeing.
Yeah. So you mentioned sort of that some investments, they have longer term horizons, 30 years. What does that mean to sort of the, when you look at it per asset class, like infrastructure has often very long lifespan. You can take that both ways, either like, well, we won't divest from this investment for another 30 years, so we have time. Or you can think, well, we're going to hold this for 30 years. We have to start now to understand what's happening to this asset over the longer term. Do you see any sort of approach to that?
I mean, what we definitely see is, that in some countries, climate change is very much factored into infrastructure planning. So when infrastructure is built now, there needs to be a provision, for instance, for sea level rise. When we look at road infrastructure or bridges, especially in exposed and vulnerable areas, they are being built with, a certain consideration for flooding, for sea level rise, for other types of extreme events. Has that necessarily happened here in Australia? Perhaps not. Should it? I think so. But that includes every type of asset that is longer lived, right? So we've got power stations, we've got transmission infrastructure, we've got transportation infrastructure, road infrastructure, right? But even things like, housing, that is also, I think, a very big area where we need to see changes in climate adaptation happening as well, right? A lot of the housing stock that we've got here, when you look locally here in Sydney, is not really adapted to climate change. These are not really infrastructures that are built for a changing climate. So I think there's a lot of work to do. The smartest way would obviously be, to really start factoring in these decisions right at this very moment so that we are not unprepared 10, 15, 20, 30 years down the track from here.
Yeah. It's a very sort of, I think, already tangible issue, because I was just reading an article about Tuvalu, and they have one international airstrip, and they're basically trying to raise the land around it because it's already being affected, and not just from high tides, but also from water coming in from the ground because of the rising sea levels.
I know that well because, as you know, I was meant to be in Kiribati as well. One of them and Tuvalu are going to be the first climate refugees. But that aside, in long duration assets, particularly real assets, there's another factor above and beyond what was just mentioned, and that's policy. For some reason, in the last 15 years or 10 years, science has become a political debate. And as a result, not just health science, such as having RFK Jr. as the head of the health, or the move away, tariff, assuming that tariff is a revenue earner, direct contradiction to known science. The same is true here in environmental science. And the way policy sets and can change depends on the political agenda, not necessarily on the science itself. And generators is one great example. Whether it's generation through coal, gas, nuclear, or solar. Or in the case of the U.S., they were nearly finished with the wind farms, and then it was too green, so let's turn it all off. So policy is another situation that needs to be considered.
Yeah, for sure. Christy, if we may turn to you, you speak with a lot of the financial institutions here in Australia. Do you see them starting to build tools and frameworks around this problem?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would add that it's not new for the finance sector to be thinking about and integrating some of these environmental risks. Just this morning, I was at the 20th anniversary of the UN Principles for Responsible Investment. So that is an initiative that has been going since 2006. It now includes in its signatory base over half of the assets under management globally. So it is not just sort of the longevity of long-term investors thinking about and integrating using a range of tools these issues, but also, I guess, the uptake, particularly in the last 5 to 10 years, and the penetration right across the financial system. I would say insurers have also been very kind of acutely aware of these physical risks because it impacts very directly on their business models. And banks are increasingly kind of recognising and using a range of different tools and approaches. Where we've got to now is that there are sort of industry-wide standard tools and frameworks, which is very helpful because previously you could assess transition risk or assess physical risk in a range of different ways, and it sort of depended on the advisory firm or the expertise that you were able to have access to. And what we saw with global frameworks like the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures and now the ISSB sort of taking up those standards is there's a much more standardised way that not just investors in the finance sector but also the corporate sector can use to assess, mitigate the risks, but also identify the opportunities. In the finance sector, they're obviously aggregators of information from the real economy, and that consistency and standardisation really matters so that you can aggregate and look across your whole portfolio. But we're not only seeing standardisation of the tools and frameworks, but a much more sophisticated way of applying them and taking decision-useful information to inform strategy and to inform sort of future direction of these institutions.
Yeah, we sort of started in the beginning by saying this is not an ESG conversation. This is a much more systemic financial stability discussion. Do you see this as well in the way that organizations approach this? Is it still very much like these are a series of ESG tools or ESG framework taxonomies? Or is there more a growing sense of this affects everything we do throughout the organization?
I think what we're seeing as organisations become more mature in their understanding of the commercial realities of all of these risks is it becomes integrated into core business of whether that's investment teams, risk teams, product development teams. And so we see in lots of the organisations we work with, it will often start in a responsible investment or a sustainable finance or an ESG function, and they will develop sort of a centre of expertise. But then where lots of the organisations we work with now are that's integrated right across the organisation. And it's, reporting might sit under the CFO or the finance function, but there's inputs and expectations that the investment teams and right across the different sort of product teams will all contribute to both mitigating risk and identifying opportunities.
Yeah. Now, environmental risk doesn't fit neatly into sort of financial models. And I was thinking we had one time a conference where somebody stood up during one of these discussions about environmental risk and basically said, well, one of the reasons why it's hard to deal with is because it's an unaccounted for risk. We don't really know how to incorporate it into our system. And that has to do with, different sets of information out there, no standardization, but also because when you model out, there's a lot of assumptions that you have to make. These are long-term trends, very far into the future. And it sort of made me think, I was talking to Rob about it, Peter Drucker, the management consultant, he said, what gets measured gets managed. He didn't say it exactly like that, but close enough. And this is hard to measure. Maybe, Martina, I can ask you, is it possible to build a comprehensive framework around this in a way that is easier to deal with?
I mean, we've definitely seen the attempt to build a framework with the TCFD recommendations, right? And now also the adoption of the climate risk reporting here in Australia as well. So I think that's definitely provided a starting point where organizations, are exposed to different categories of risks and are guided, I think, also through, a process to actually assess those risks, right? Looking into the physical risk, looking into the transition risk, looking into other types of risk factors. But I think importantly also changing their outlook towards the future, right? This reporting is no longer about past performance and past financial risk, right? It's really around assessing what is going to be happening going forward, right? How does our exposure look like to climate change when we factor in different types of climate scenarios? And in my view, this is the most interesting part of the reporting exercise, but I think also the most challenging to actually implement, right? Because it does require a lot of expertise in really understanding the climate risks and the modeling as well. And that is not necessarily expertise that has, traditionally been held by companies or, that was traditionally factored in. There's certainly, at this point, still a lot of sense-making going on around how to best do it. And I think also a lot of uncertainty around, how do we best do it, and how do we make these scenarios that sometimes seem very abstract, how do we actually make them tangible? How can we operationalize them for the company, right? What do they mean for specific sectors and locations, for specific assets and so on? And there's all sorts of different ways, to downscale them. But more importantly, it is really forcing, I think, this exposure to, okay, we will have a changed reality. We no longer have business as usual. There will be a different reality. And what does that reality actually look like? What are the impacts here? And they will be felt differently, again, across different sectors, across different firms, across different locations, based on their exposure, their operations, infrastructure, and so on. But, also in terms of indirect exposure through energy costs and whatnot, So I think there's definitely a lot to think through. Interestingly enough, I think it really requires that understanding of, future change and how future change is going to have consequences. There are certainly all sorts of indicators that companies can now use to report, and under the current reporting structure, there are also categories obviously that need to be reported on. But in my mind, that's really the very interesting part. But also where we see that there's still a lot of expertise needed to really fully engage with future scenarios and what they mean, but also because there is uncertainty in these scenarios as well, which obviously we have to acknowledge, right? Because the scenarios are not a given. They're changing as we are changing as a society as well, so factoring in different types of policy changes and different types of physical risks is going to end up with a future scenario. And I think sometimes that's very confusing, when it comes to selecting the best scenario, and there is not necessarily a best scenario to select, which, we at least see is creating some sort of, uncertainty around, okay, what future should we actually look at or prepare for? But again, it really forces that sort of, exposure and engagement with a changed future. But also, I think importantly, it really requires companies to think through how to address it as well, right? So, for instance, two firms may disclose the same type of exposure to heat or to extreme weather, but ultimately it comes down to who has got the operational flexibility, the resources, right, the capital required to actually adapt to these types of changes. And, in my mind, that's really, the sort of interesting questions that, we get into with these types of reporting exercises.
Yeah. So a while ago, I looked into sort of the criticism around integrated assessment models and the tendency to sort of look at a very isolated environment and not necessarily take into account trends that move across countries, across jurisdictions. And it sort of struck me that when I looked at the literature that's out there from climate scientists and the way that the finance industry incorporates is quite different. So to give you a tangible example, I've looked at a couple of super fund reports, and they do these scenarios where they say, okay, this is the impact on our portfolio at 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees, 5 degrees, 6 degrees. And even I think at 6 degrees, it was like, we think it's about 1.2% lower than what it is now. And then I showed it to the climate scientists, and they're like, at 6 degrees, we're dead. So there's a kind of a big difference into how they deal with these forecasts. Is there any improvement on that, or what do you think about that?
Yeah, look, I think sometimes the scenarios that we see coming out from the sciences are used in a very instrumental sort of fashion when they're incorporated, like you just mentioned, in a report in a sort of like straightforward kind of way without actually looking at the bigger picture behind it. We do see more sophistication around it, which is, I think, part of this sort of like evolution as well in how companies are engaging with climate risks, with future scenario analysis as well. Part of the issue, I think, is because these fields have traditionally not really connected to each other, right? Climate science was never started with the view towards informing finance, and finance was never started with a view towards, actually needing to be informed by climate science. So there's definitely a communication issue at the intersection of these fields. But there's certainly also where people like myself come in, right, with the work that we are doing within the Center for Climate Risk and Resilience, where we are really looking at ways, how can we communicate communicate those risks? How can we visualize them, right? How can we make them tangible in a way that this becomes more sort of, or is being brought to life rather than just being this abstract sort of risk that just being factored in as a number into a modeling exercise, because it is definitely not just a temperature increase, right? It's a very systemic, it's a very, very comprehensive change that we are going to be seeing that's affecting all levels of society, right? If we've got a 6-degree rise, just to take your extreme example here in Sydney, there will be parts of Western Sydney where areas might actually become uninhabitable, right? Or where it will be very challenging to provide enough cooling, to provide enough shade in some communities. So all of that just, is creating a much bigger systemic issue, water stress, how do we actually get enough food on our plates under such a scenario? And sometimes these risks, I think the systemic nature of the risk is a really, really challenging part to fully incorporate and to fully understand. But I think it's needed that we really engage with those types of questions.
Yeah. And Christy, what sort of efforts do you see to convert these type of risks into action?
Yeah, I think this point that you were making, Martina, about essentially the capability that is needed and that being probably developed in other disciplines is something that we work with across the finance sector quite a lot. There's this multidisciplinary approach that is needed for financial institutions to understand these risks, to make sense of them and to apply them in a business context as well. So we see that being sort of a huge unlocker of not just better mitigating risk, but also in capitalising on those opportunities and being able to sort of forecast, not predict, but to look at the range of potential future scenarios and what that would mean for business models and strategy and things at that point. What we do see, and this is sort of across business and finance, is people, because they don't necessarily have the technical capability, find tools and frameworks that make it very clear what and how you need to do as a base level, really important and a really critical way to get started in better understanding these risks. And as I said, the tools and frameworks are growing both in sort of sophistication, but also importantly moving just from a risk to an opportunity lens. And that's where taxonomies come in place, which essentially identify what sorts of investments and economic activities will support the transition, the climate transition. So rather than needing to understand how different sectors may evolve and will, crunching all the science on an individual investment level to see whether a particular technology or a particular activity will support the climate transition to net zero, a taxonomy sort of outlines those activities and measures so that it's much easier for capital to flow towards those measures that are supportive of the transition. And we see now the taxonomy being sort of adopted across the market. I think we're up to the 6th or 7th taxonomy aligned transaction in the sort of debt capital market space, and a number of sub-sovereign as well as bank sustainable finance frameworks are now aligned with the taxonomy. So it is something that the finance sector both supported the development of it and now is sort of finding really useful as a tool.
Yeah.
What I don't understand, because I've heard that before as well, what your comments, Walter, and other than maybe endowment funds, pensions have a long-term liability that we're trying to immunize. So by definition, we have a long-term outlook. Some of the biggest investors in unlisted real assets are pension funds because they say we like the long tail of it and it matches our liability. So then to walk away from the long tail implications from environment doesn't really quite add up. I'm not really sure about that. And secondly, I think we need to differentiate the difference between inputs and outputs. And the output is that we're seeing the numbers firsthand because many super funds are large investors in insurance companies. Even catastrophe bonds are now an asset class that they're looking into invest. So they are investing in these asset classes. They have access to this information. And whereas the data may be difficult to model, not trying to model it or understand it is an active bet. And it's an active bet that may or may not pay off, but if you look at the numbers, it probably won't pay off. And then lastly, I think it's true that most boards, ICs, don't necessarily understand the full implications. And I understand, I respect that. But do they understand the billions of dollars that are going into data centers? Do they understand what the payout is going to be? Do they understand that the shelf life of many data centers is 5 years? Yet the amount of billions that's required to build them? So the irony is we have a long-tailed outlook. We invest in long-tailed and long-duration assets, but when it gets complicated, even though the numbers are right in front of them, we claim it's too difficult, and we put our arms in the air. And that's where I would challenge trustees and IC members.
There is that inherent sort of tension between the short term and the long term within the finance industry, because you obviously saw that when Russia invaded the Ukraine, there were a lot of funds here in Australia that had moved to low carbon indices as their benchmarks, got hit more severely than other funds. And that caused a little bit of a rethink with some of those funds. So you will have these type of points during the next couple of years as well. How do you deal with that sort of short-term tension where, we have to be the best fund over, the next 5 years versus the longer-term systemic issues that this is referring to?
Complete mismatch. And it starts from the top. You've heard me numerous times bickering about heat maps, where it's a race to the middle.
Yep.
Where if a pension moves in a certain direction and for a short period of a long duration portfolio objective for a short period is not meeting that relative to the peers, they get penalized. And so what almost requires in your example is everyone has to do it. So therefore there won't be financial consequences and regulatory consequences for veering into something that's in front of us. It's the regulatory system around many super funds requires all or none, that everyone has to move in that direction. And to do that in the world of investments, where there's always a buyer and there's always a seller, is very challenging.
Yeah. You brought insurance up with catastrophe bonds. I think we've seen some of the insurance companies becoming probably first aware of climate change and the impact on their business, just by the nature of it's affecting their claim experience, it's affecting how they price their coverage. But ultimately, they can't carry all of the risk, and that will filter through. At the same time, some insurances might become impossible, and I think it's sometimes said that for any economic activity to occur, you need to have insurance first. Otherwise, nobody's going to take any risk. How do you see that moving when the risk of environmental risk becomes too much for insurance companies to carry, and it filters through? Does it filter through to other companies, to members? What do you think around that?
Well, let's look at insurance and why it exists in the first place. It takes away the sting of the unexpected. Whether if we date back to insurance roots or Lloyd's and the shipping through to modern day, as investors, as lenders, obviously we want to know that there is an exit where a return is not only generated, but at least the capital is returned. The reality, though, particularly with insurance, is that while politicians debate the science around environment, whether it's true or not, right beneath them is a situation where households are feeling it immediately. Ask any household what their home insurance was 5 years ago versus what it is today. APRA themselves are fearful that 1 in 4 households will not be able to afford insurance in the future. And in coastal towns, it's 50%. So who insures these homes? Who insures these farms? Who insures these businesses that exist up and down? We know here in Australia, 90% of our population live within 100 miles. I think it's even higher than that, but regardless, live within 100 miles of the coast. We are a coastal community. And whether we're talking floods, whether we're talking bushfires, or any other type of environmental type damage, these rural communities are feeling it immediately. The challenge, however, is that even though we actually see these numbers It's become politicized, where the rural community is now concerned about sustainability of their livelihood, not talking about their actual homes or businesses, but I'm talking about employability, where there's some sort of affront against carbon energy, or whether it's coal mining towns in the Newcastle area, or whether it's LNG in the WA, where these communities are very vocal about climate control issues. Politicians, particularly populists, are grabbing into that. Regardless, insurance is an environmental risk that has now become an input. It's now visible. It's not just visible in portfolios, it's even more visible in households. And so now we need to understand that as insurance affordability is creating these insurance deserts where people can no longer get insured, do we honestly believe that the government will let these people go uninsured if a catastrophe occurs? And if not, then the ultimate underwriter is the taxpayer.
Yep.
And before anyone gets overly up in arms, we've handed out more billions to corporations who were on their knees because it was necessary, quote unquote.
Yeah.
So ask yourself that same question. When a large portion of rural Australia is unable to insure themselves, who is the ultimate underwriter of that insurance package?
Yeah.
It's you and me.
Yeah, for sure. Christy, when we talk about insurance, it's more or less like an expectation that the event has occurred, and insurance is sort of dealing with the aftermath of that. How do you look at sort of models that firms come up with that try to anticipate these things from happening and potentially direct capital towards mitigating these risks?
Yeah, and I think that is the absolute silver bullet in this adaptation resilience space, is shifting the investment to build resilience in advance rather than the current model, which is supporting disaster recovery and rebuilding after an event has occurred. And that's governments have that sort of model of funding, as well as that's the insurance kind of model. That said, a number of insurance companies are working much more proactively with their customers to support them to build resilience at the household level. But there's still a lot more that can be done in that proactive space. And there's been sort of lots of research that has demonstrated the economic payback of that. So for every dollar invested up front, you save $9.60 in recovery costs. We're already, the Australian government, spending $38 billion annually on natural disasters, so governments across Australia, and that's projected to go up to $73 billion a year by 2060 if there's not a huge amount invested up front in adaptation resilience. So the numbers are very clear and compelling. There's a range of reasons as to why that value is not able to be captured in kind of investment models at the moment, and why it's difficult for both governments as well as private businesses and investors to make that case for those upfront costs and expenditure. That said, there's a range of things that the work we've done with other players right across the finance sector shows will help to shift that dial. One is around valuation approaches and frameworks, and the Actuaries Institute has done a huge amount of excellent work on the relatively small tweaks that you can make to the way valuation frameworks that the public and the private sector use to shift that, that business case to make it much more compelling to make the investment upfront rather than the recovery investment. The other issue often with adaptation resilience investment is the benefits or the avoided losses don't necessarily accrue to the same actor that is making the investment upfront. So if you're investing in sort of community-based infrastructure, a local council whose source of revenue is from all ratepayers, there'll be only a certain sort of small portion of those ratepayers that will benefit in terms of reduction in their insurance premiums, for example, those that are most flood affected if it's sort of flood resilience works. So there's a range of interesting models that are being used internationally to try and use various different structuring approaches and sort of multi-stakeholder collaborative co-design processes so that you can solve some of those issues. The other issue often is that there's projects at sort of small scales. And so for a commercial investor, that's not necessarily at the scale or the aggregation at which makes it attractive for them, and they're not always able to capture the commercial benefits. Again, sort of structuring and project preparation facilities can support with that. And blended finance is another sort of approach where it's combined public and commercial capital so that you can put those investments at a risk and return that's acceptable to a commercial investor over time.
Yeah. On this list is also adaptation finance. What's that?
Yeah, so all of those models that I was talking about are a version of different types of adaptation financing structures. There's also when you've got sort of existing assets and you're a long-term investor in an existing asset, increasingly those equity holders are seeing value in improving the resilience of an asset to reduce operational expenditure over time, particularly when there is a disaster. So there's a number of fund managers and others who very actively work with their assets, where they sit on the board or they're sort of a minority shareholder but a significant shareholder, to improve not just the understanding of the risk, but invest capital to improve the resilience of those assets, which will over time reduce operating expenditure and insurance premiums for those assets as well.
Martina, we often talk about disclosure is not the same as resilience. You can show where all the risks are, but what are you actually doing about it? Can you tell me a little bit from your perspective, what does real resilience look like?
Yeah, that's a big question. I'm not quite sure if I can answer that in the time we've got available, but I'll try. When we look at resilience, and I've done a lot of work around resilience, there's obviously this common understanding of resilience that, there is a negative impact, be that on a company, on a household, or on some other type of entity. And then the effort is always to sort of go back to where we used to be, to bounce back to previous conditions. So that is what we typically understand as resilience. The challenge with climate change, or the added challenge that we are now facing, is that simply building back to where we used to be is often not the answer anymore. Example, right? When we've got communities that are flood affected, there's been, a negative impact. And then if this community builds back in exactly the same way, which could be seen as resilient, right? But let's assume we go back to exactly the same state that we were in. It's not really creating any type of, risk mitigation or insurance against future events. If we're exactly in the same position, exactly in the same spot, we're doing exactly what we used to do, it's not really a preparation against any type of future risk. So the added challenge definitely with climate resilience is that we need to think about ways to actually build back in ways that factor that in, right? So to look into this, future risk that is unfolding, meaning that, we need to see that resilience in relation to a changed future. So simply bouncing back, building back is often not the answer here in these particular situations. So yeah, certainly, disclosure alone, as you said, is definitely not related to resilience. I mean, I can disclose all sorts of things. Doesn't actually mean that, I'm resilient when the time comes. So I think what's very important with resilience as well is that resilience is a collective effort. So with mitigation, let's assume I'm a high carbon emitting company. With mitigation, I can look internally for solutions. How can I, emit less carbon by, innovating, by looking into more energy efficient infrastructure investments, these types of actions. With resilience, it just becomes much more difficult because resilience does require a much more concerted effort, within society. So for instance, if I'm a company affected by sea level rise, it's often not just sufficient to build my own seawall around my own assets, but I'm actually part of a broader, societal sort of problem. I'm embedded within broader infrastructure that's affected by sea level rise. So consequently, if I'm not located in a resilient community or in a community that at least has got some, level of adaptation in place, then it just means that I can't be resilient under those circumstances, So it is much more of a systems issue, which means it's also much more of a coordination challenge and much more of an investment challenge, which, is creating, I think, real questions around who should be paying. Chrissy already said who is benefiting from this, who makes these types of investments, and it often does require public-private partnerships to really make these types of changes that actually pays off. But then also there are real difficulties in seeing the payoffs, because we are very bad when it comes to recognizing avoided losses. So everyone sees, the big impact that a disaster has and how quick we can build back, and that's often seen as the success story, right? The faster we can go back to normal, the better it is, and that's often really equated with success. But where we are not looking for successes is when it comes to, avoided losses. We can't see them. They don't feel like we've accomplished anything, right? It's basically invisible, and this invisibility is a real challenge here as well, because people can't really see what would have happened if we hadn't made those types of investments, and that's often stopping these considerations, right? Because it's much more, it's much more impactful to act when something has actually happened rather than just preventing it from happening. I think these are really big considerations here. But I think one additional important point is that resilience is not just around having defensive infrastructure in place. It's not just around having defensive assets. It's really a proactive approach around how can we absorb shocks, how can we actually adapt operations, how can we be flexible, how can we recover effectively. Sometimes it requires a transformation of business models, so it actually requires a much more multi-level kind of way of thinking as well. And obviously it does not just relate to climate change alone. We've had many, many other shocks happening, and a lot of them are really impactful, and resilience is definitely something that should not be developed just with one particular threat in mind, but actually as a capability that allows a lot of flexibility no matter what the extreme event or the adverse condition is that we are facing.
Yeah. Now, Rob, from the investment industry, we look at risk at basically from two sides. Of course, it's risk that can wipe out your capital, but you can't make money without taking on risk. That's where the returns to a degree come from. Why is not more money flowing into this area in terms of prevention and dealing with environmental risks?
I've always said if we could patent air, water, and a clean environment, we would invest in it. But we disregard it because it's free, or we underestimate its value because it's free. The thing to consider, I guess, is that for many of us, we are accustomed to market cycles. And those market cycles were met with enthusiasm and then eventually mean reversion. As Martina mentioned, this is much more structural. This is itself a very a structural event, and it's how we build a resilient model around it. Isn't just a portfolio issue. It's a policy issue on top of that. Martina's point was very valid. Imagine building, being Dutch yourself, imagine building only a wall around your small house, but there's no wall around it, or New Orleans, or in southwest England, or southeast England, It would serve no purpose. This is a societal problem. This is a societal issue. Our challenge right now is that we're trying to look at it through lenses that aren't necessarily built for that. And because those lenses aren't disclosing what we need to see, we either disregard or, too complicated, put it aside. I'll deal with it tomorrow. But the more we go down that path, the more pardon the pun, the wave builds. And therefore the longer it takes to unwind from that. As for a portfolio, as I mentioned before, how we actually address that, the numbers are there. Whether we agree on the validity of whether it's 1 degree or 2 degrees, talk to any actuary, talk to an insurance company. They have the numbers to show you of the claims. They have the numbers to show you. So we can debate all you like about the science of the environment, but when we equate it back to the actual economy, at least as expressed through insurance, the numbers are already showing a huge uptick. And whether you see it directly through the books, the insurance books, or through the premiums that we've been paying, it's getting increasingly harder to ignore.
Yeah. And what do you think of Martina's comment that, to a degree, what you're trying to achieve with addressing these risks is for things not to occur? So if you're trying to put capital to work, you often want an outcome. In this case, you often work to prevent things and hope that stuff doesn't happen.
We don't have a DCF for opportunity cost.
Yeah.
It's that simple. What is the growth rate that I would use for environmental issues? Martina said it well. The environmental science was on its own. We as investors, we're the generalists. We're the ones who are, particularly pension fund investors. We're paid to take long-term views, and we have a portfolio that has large exposure to long-duration assets. And so there perhaps is a gap between our due diligence and how we actually manage the portfolio and what the inputs are that we assess versus what we're actually investing in.
Yeah. Perhaps we can draw the conversation a bit closer to home, look at Australia. Obviously, we have a very unique economy in the sense that's heavily reliant on resources, heavily reliant on energy, and also agriculture to an extent. These are all sectors that are sort of in the crosshairs of environmental risk. What is your sense, and maybe Christy, I can come to you, what's your sense of how stakeholders deal with this issue that any action that we take will be felt in the economy, and then in extension of that, especially in regional Australia, and sometimes these communities are not always brought along in the discussion. They just got rules imposed on them. But what's your sense around that? Is it harder to implement here, and what can be done?
I'd actually like to reframe the question, which is all about, you mentioned sort of crosshairs of change happening to communities. There are many communities that are driving this transition and see huge economic opportunity from sort of a green export sort of future economy that Australia is in the box seat to take advantage of. So yes, we have an agriculture industry that is among one of the best performing sustainability-wise in the world. We also have a huge kind of mining and resources sector that can provide things like copper, critical minerals, iron ore that will be absolutely needed for the transition, not just of Australia, but for the world. There are a number of different regions and communities that are seeing and working to develop what that economic development vision for the future looks like, and are bringing in then investors and partners and different parts of government in around that sort of community-driven vision. So absolutely agree, there is the need for communities to be in that driving seat and to be actively shaping, driving, and bringing others in to support what will be a big transition globally, but particularly in a number of different local communities. But I wouldn't want what we see in mainstream media to be the prevailing narrative of this happening to regional communities, rather than many regional communities kind of absolutely getting in front and driving this transition so that it benefits kind of them and the future prosperity of the businesses and the regions that they live in and have lived in for a long time.
Yeah. Martina, what do you think about this? I mean, risk does tend to hit differently in different areas. Does it make it harder to create policy on or frameworks?
Yeah, I mean, what we're definitely seeing is that there is a very uneven distribution of risk and impact. There's definitely parts of Australia that are much more exposed, but we also see a huge variability in terms of the extremes that communities are exposed to, and certainly also see, different needs for support and different, transition requirements, and, essentially, not all of that is reflected in policy decisions, because especially when they're taken very top-down, in a very top-down fashion, right? It's not necessarily giving that sort of diversified policy set on the ground. But I agree with the comments that Christy made. Right? We're definitely seeing a lot of momentum at the moment. We are seeing that a lot of communities really want to be part of a transition that's happening. We're seeing a lot of momentum, be that both in rural and remote areas, but I think also in the cities as well. There is a lot of momentum actually to see, what we can do. And the underlying driver, I think, for a lot of people is to really also live in an environment that's worthwhile living in. There's so much that we can do and, create a much more livable environment. Certainly we see that in Europe, right? Just putting cycling infrastructure in has got, so many benefits, right? And this is such a small scale example, but, it takes cars off the road. It allows for more physical activity. It just, makes people actually, feel, a lot better about their day as well if they're not just stuck in traffic and so on, right? And there are just all these kind of small scale changes that we can definitely implement also quite easily that are really adding up, to a lot of change as well. But coming back to the sort of more fundamental issues, we definitely see an uneven distribution, I think, of climate risk, of physical risk, of transition risks as well. And it's very deeply tied to, the kind of sort of like sectors and distributions that we see in Australia as well around resources, agriculture, right, energy export issues, climate sensitive sectors. So there's obviously huge exposure in parts of Australia. But then, as I said, there's also a huge variability in terms of the physical risk, ranging from bushfires to drought to, in some parts, right, we see other types of extreme events, extreme heats. We've got cyclones, right? So it's actually, there's also a lot to deal with from the impact side. And when we look into the climate projections, none of this is really forecasted to get much better, which creates a significant concern certainly. But I think more to the point, the looking into any type of transition, I think it's really important, that this is an equitable transition, that this brings people along in actually being part of it as well. And as I mentioned, it's definitely not just about infrastructural investment. It's also a huge part around, social, regional resilience, cultural change within society as well. But at the end of this, I think there's also huge opportunities involved in this, because we can actually really look into building a better future.
So I was speaking a while ago to an economist, and he suggested that perhaps if you look at areas like the Hunter Valley that is very dependent on coal, perhaps there should be more of a government-driven push to restructure these sectors and potentially build an EV industry in the Hunter Valley. Do you think it needs to be more from government-driven as well to force almost this change?
In my mind, the most effective change is essentially the change that's occurring, across all parts of society. I don't think it's particularly good if policy just steps in and forces an issue, right? It's not really going to be accepted, within local communities, especially if it goes against some of the locally held values. By the same degree, just having, this grounds up sort of movement can sometimes also be ineffective if there's no supporting policy trigger, actually. And I think, or just looking across what actually the evidence tells us and the research tells us, the most successful transitions in society, we see those occurring where, every part of society can actually, benefit from the transition, but can also have input into these types of decisions. So it's not top down, it's not bottom up, but I think it really needs to happen at all levels. Certainly that's hard to achieve. There is no perfect solution to it, but in my mind, it really requires supportive policies that encourage, new sectors to evolve, that encourage investment in renewable energies, that certainly support a phase out of fossil fuels, but at the same time, it really needs to bring the communities along as well, right? Just simply discontinuing fossil fuels is not going to be a solution for some regions, right? It really needs to be part of a broader transition, and there needs to be consideration around, okay, how do we best structure this? How do we create other opportunities? But also how do we do it in a way that this is an equitable transition and that it actually provides opportunities to people as well.
Yeah. Rob, you got some views on this as well, because I think you say policy risk is an investment risk.
Absolutely. Now, I would add social consent to that.
Yeah.
But before I do, your point about, I guess, some of those communities that have ties to carbon energy, be it coal or LNG. Let's look back at Wollongong versus Newcastle. back in the 60s, they were both economically thriving off steel. Steel left. Newcastle had an advantage that it had big black rocks underneath it or nearby that opened up a new industry. And if we look at the history of Australia, we've had many industries that have come and go. In the mid 1800s, one of the largest industries in exports was fur, but seal fur.
Yep.
In fact, we almost went to war with the U.S. over a land fight over seal fur.
Yeah.
My point is that economic history is full of cycles of what works and not. But if we work to create moats that protect certain cycles or certain industries, as opposed to protect the overall ecosystem, those are two different things. And and it's not just Trump didn't just do this, but we've become more transactional. What's in it for me? And that transactional has, I would argue, been a key factor in driving the breakup of the LNP between the city conservative and the rural conservative. The city conservative is more willing to embrace the challenges of the environmental issues and has morphed away from the traditional conservative movement towards the teal as a result. Yeah. The rural community has embraced it because, again, their checkbooks depend on it, their salaries depend on it. And so they've been gravitating more towards a populist rhetoric of One Nation, Clive Palmer, and the others. And whether mainstream politics recognizes this or not, this is an issue that is not just a social and structural issue, but it's a heavily political issue founded on a level of social consent. And as we all know, there's a hell of a lot of misinformation out there. Case in point, on the South Coast, if you drive by or walking along the coastline, you'll see some of the houses with large banners, no wind farms.
Yep.
Never mind that the wind farms are going to be so far out. It's not necessarily. I respect that they have a right to, they have a democratic right to vote against it and be against it, but some of the reasoning that I saw why they were against it wasn't necessarily logical. And that lack of logic was driving a social consent or lack thereof, which was influencing policy off of frustration that was not logical.
And so how do you get them to come along on the journey?
Well, ironically as well, these are the same towns that are seeing their insurance premiums rise and at a substantial amount. And so, whether we embrace it or not, climate issue is not a political debate. We have to find a way to look at it fundamentally for what it is and strip away and silence the misinformation and politically motivated rhetoric and look at it for what it is. Is it perfect? No. But, this is how the political divide works. If it's not perfect, if it's not yes or no, I'm not interested.
No.
Our world is in the middle.
Does it require a big disaster, you think, before we see some real change happening in this space?
Define big disaster. My friends in Kiribati would tell you we're there.
Yeah.
So big disaster as it affects us, perhaps, and it's interesting to the point I think that Christy made that some rural communities are embracing this. I'm going to take a punt, and I'm going to assume that those communities are not necessarily tied towards carbon energy, such as the South Coast and the bushfires that we've seen on the South Coast. I know they've been very proactive on these environmental issues and building resilience because they suffered so severely during the bushfires. Whereas that same level of interest towards a more resilient outcome is less visible in carbon energy rural areas.
Yes, and you have the areas that are more exposed to tourism that probably have more of a stake in mitigating climate change.
But even the city people as well. The city conservatives in the eastern suburbs, few would be negating the issue around environmental challenges. And I think that was one of the big drivers of why they were frustrated with mainstream politics, and they went towards the independents.
Yeah. So Rob, you suggested to end up with sort of a thought experiment to a degree, where let's assume it's tomorrow, Monday. You come back into the company floor, the boardroom floor. If you're a CIO or a trustee or a policymaker, what different questions should you ask on this Monday morning than before we started this conversation? Do you want to have a crack at this? Or?
Sure. I guess at the end of the day, it's the same question we should be asking ever. Where are the risks? Where do they lie? And where does the portfolio still assume that the old hedge is holding? I would fathom to guess it's going to be more exposed in the long duration real assets that are highly illiquid, that they have a 20% exposure towards, sizable. That doesn't mean that if the proverbial hits the fan for those assets, it's not going to hit the other assets. Of course it is. It's going to hit government bonds, it's going to hit spreads, it's going to hit equity markets. But with a liquid asset, you hold it. You cannot unwind. And where are we assuming some sort of linear adjustment to this non-linear risk? If we look at it that way, perhaps that will flag. And super funds and pension funds have been very proactive in attempting to quantify this. But again, I would put it more simply. What parts of our portfolio is assuming that the old hedge will hold?
Martina, can I ask you the same question? What questions should we ask on a Monday morning?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not sure if that's just the question for the Monday morning. Probably a more fundamental one. But I think one of the important questions is, what do we value? Right. I think that's very important. Do we want to be part of the problem? Do we want to be part of the solution? Is in my mind just a very fundamental question, because it really comes down to what's really driving the change and whether or not people want to actually, change and do things differently. More fundamentally, it would also be around the assumptions on which the business model or any type of risk modeling or financial modeling is built. I think there's a set of really important questions around what are the assumptions that we are making, and are they still holding? Are they still the same assumptions? So historical data points have always been very important, right, around insurance pricing, infrastructure design, planning, capital allocation. But are these assumptions still holding, or are there a different set of assumptions that might have to be made? Because climate change is obviously complicating a few things, right? So historical baselines are now being less applicable and less reliable. Tail risks are becoming more important. Extremes are becoming more important, but also on shorter time horizons. There's sometimes these sort of like, it's a 1 in 50 year event or 1 in 100 year event. This is obviously no longer applicable in this day and age, right? So questioning those types of assumptions is in my mind very, very important, and to perhaps just as a thought experiment as well, go with a different set of assumptions and see where they would actually take you, right? Is that still what you're doing? Is it still viable if you are essentially using a fundamentally different set of assumptions? You might not want to keep them, you might not want to implement them, but as part of the scenario planning that I mentioned, having different assumptions can be, I think, a really important starting point just to challenge some of the thinking, and it might be something that people want to adopt, it might be something they don't want to adopt, but at least having that awareness of the assumptions that are being made is already, in my mind, a really, really important point to start the conversation.
And Christy, maybe not on Monday morning then, but what are the fundamental questions?
So mine's building on Martina's, so they can tackle her question first and then come to mine, which is also based on this idea of scenarios. So if you were to think of what the world, Australia, our industry looks like in 10 years' time, what is the range of possibilities? So what is the range of kind of best case, worst case scenarios? And then if we as a company or an organisation were to lean in to give the best chance of success at the best case scenario, what would we do differently to what we're doing today? How can we use all of the things that we have at our disposal to kind of get us closer to what that best case possibility looks like?
Yeah.
It's not lack of investability. I mean, we've shown it. The investment world has invested billions and billions and billions towards AI, where none of us really know how that's going to end.
Yeah.
We have invested in a story without certainty of some sort of terminal value. And so therefore, if we're willing to do it with AI, from an investment point of view, perhaps we should look at the same approach from a positioning point of view.
Yeah.
With regards to the challenges, and to Christy's point, the best worst case scenarios. We do that in most assets already. And to extend this into this matter is challenging, but it's challenging in every asset that we do it under.
Yeah.
Other than cash.
So we started sort of the conversation with looking at whether the assumptions on climate and climate risks have changed and whether this will filter through more and more into the financial system. And I think, for my audience in the investor world, it raises a lot of questions around, is the portfolio running on assumptions that no longer hold true? Are you assuming a level of insurability that might have already moved on? And as you said as well, is there an expectation of sort of a gradual change that might actually turn out to be much more jumpy, much more volatile going forward? Now, I'm not sure if we answered any of these questions, but hopefully we certainly have given people something to think about. And I would like to thank you for participating in this discussion. So thank you, Christy, Rob, and Martina.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the i3 podcast. For more information, please visit our website at www.i3, that's the letter I, the number 3, -invest.com. And don't forget to like, subscribe and review. Thank you very much.